Ever.
For real. Hello and welcome to the AP Literature online sessions. We are really excited that you are joining us today and hopefully for the next few weeks. My name is Susan Barber and I am from Atlanta, Georgia. Shout out to Grady High School where I teach. And this is going to be my co-teacher for the next month, Bear. He'll be with us. And we are just really excited to spend these next few weeks with you reinforcing things that your teachers have already been teaching you in your classroom and just helping you prepare for the AP Lit exam. More importantly than that, even though we do want to prepare you, we just want to help you become better readers, better thinkers, and better writers over these next few weeks because those skills are going to carry you far in life. So teaching with me for the next several weeks is Mr. Escobar, and I'm going to let him introduce himself.
How are you guys? My name is Carlos Escobar. I am a teacher in Miami, Florida at Felix Varela Senior High School. And like Ms. Barber said, I'm very excited to be here. This is all very new to me. I'm more of a face-to-face person, but these are uh, different times, right? We'll call it that, and we're all learning to adapt. So here we are. One of the things that I want to make sure that we establish is we have to be a learning community. I need to make sure that I'm talking to my students out there, and Ms. Barber and I are very excited to treat this as our virtual classroom each day. Now, there's a lot of questions out there, a lot of questions about what's the exam going to look like and what's going to be on it and all that stuff. We're going to get to all that. What we have to say, though, is that the College Board is they have been working with universities as much as they can in order to make sure that whoever deserves credit is still going to receive that credit. But obviously, the universities have a concern. They say, well, if the test is going to be shortened, will students learn less material? And that's one of the reasons why we're going to be focusing on some of the skills and some of the ideas that we would normally talk about at the end of this course to make sure that we ensure universities that everyone is going to learn all the material that's normally taught in this course. And you better believe that we are going to be spending most of our time, though, focusing on those skills and ideas that will be necessary for this year's exam. As more information comes about, we're going to be able to adapt our calendar.
So in about a week, you are going to receive a calendar and it will have every day's topic between now and May 1st. So you'll know exactly what we're going to be covering in the lessons. After today, you will have a good idea of what each lesson will look like. And that way you'll be able to decide which lessons are going to be most beneficial for you in your review, or your teachers can decide what lessons they might want you to watch for extra practice. The one thing, like I said before, that we are committed to is we do want to help you develop skills where you read more closely, where you think more critically, and you're able to write more analytically. We are committed to focusing on all of those skills in every lesson.
Absolutely. And for today's lesson, we're going to be looking at poetic structure. And we need to build a common language. I think for all of these skills that we're going to be talking about through May 1st, we need to make sure that when Ms. Barber and I say something, you're understanding exactly what we mean by it, because a lot of teachers may use different terminology, right? So what exactly do we mean by poetic structure? We're talking about those components that create not just the physical structure of the poem, right? What does the poem look like? But also the structures that move us through the poem, right? Do we move from one stanza to the next? Are there any shifts involved? Those are the types of components that we're going to be talking about. But we need to recognize also it's not just about learning terminology, right? How do we apply the things that we're learning? I've always considered poetry to be extremely rewarding, extremely enriching, right? But when you first delve into the reading of poetry, it can be a little intimidating because our experience with poetry is not as vast as our experience with prose normally. So when you're looking at a poem and your teacher gives you a 20, 30, 40 line poem, it can be really, really overwhelming. So one of the things that we need to learn how to do is how to chunk the text, right? And by chunking, I just mean grouping it into lines that make sense within a context, right? So the structure sometimes helps you create these chunks. And we're going to look at what we mean by that. We're also going to be looking at shifts. If you're able to determine that between, let's say, lines 1 and 5, something is going on, and then there's a shift. It could be a dramatic shift or a very subtle shift. You can already start to chunk the text through the shifts and also see how it's moving. Again, poetic structure is not just about what it looks like, but also about how we progress through the poem. Ultimately, learning the terms and seeing how it helps us read the poem have one common goal, which is helping us interpret the meaning of the poem and delving deeper into our analysis of the poem. To help us do that, we're going to do a little warm-up exercise, okay? We're going to start with something very, very obvious, maybe, but maybe not for everyone, okay? So what do we mean by poetic structure? Let's look at George Herbert's Easter Wings. And this is only the first stanza of that poem, and it's maybe a poem that you've already read in class. And by just looking at this poem, something is definitely going on, right? This doesn't look like a normal block poem that you would expect. And you're trying to determine, well, what is the poetic structure? It's called Easter Wings. If we tilt our heads just a little bit, we might get this, right? And you got to use your imagination here, okay? I wish I could put pictures up here, but I'm not that techie yet. But this is sort of the picture of a wing. And I told you it's only the first stanza. The second stanza will look the same. So now you have a pair of wings. You have a set of wings. And the poem, if you recall, I can go back here, is called Easter Wings. So what is meant by poetic structure? For this poem, literally the physical creation of the poem creates a structure, and it's a structure that ties right back to the title. I don't know how many of your teachers have told you this or how many times each of your teachers has told you this, but please read the title of the poems. There are so many examples where the answer's in the title. And, I don't know what it is. I don't know if students just skip over the title or they read it quickly and then forget about it. But here, the title is telling you something about the structure. Don't we wish, Miss Barber, that every poem were like this, right? The structure was so obvious. It's just a physical manifestation of what the poet wants to convey, but that's not always the case, right?
It's not always the case. And most of the time, poems are not going to have a concrete or physical outline that translates or reinforces the meaning. However, most poems are structured in a way that you can still pick up on the structural forms, and it can help you dive into the poem. It can give you a way into the poem so that you can begin to understand what the poem is talking about. We are going to review the sonnet today. Most likely you have already talked about this in class, so this is going to be a review for most of you. If this is new to you, you might want to jot down some notes, but let's look at the sonnet. We start with the sonnet because the sonnet is a very structured poem. And it's easy to take cues from a very structured poem, and then we can go to less structured poems in the next couple of weeks and talk about how we find meaning there. The sonnet, 14 lines, always 14 lines. And you'll see if you're looking at an Italian sonnet, Petrarchan sonnet, it will be divided into an octave and a sestet. The first 8 lines made up, signified by this ABBA, ABBA rhyme scheme. That octave, those first 8 lines, are going to introduce some type of topic or issue or question, maybe, that the poet wants to explore. And then we have this shift, like Mr. Escobar talked about. The shift in the sonnet almost always occurs around this 8 or 9 line mark. Then we shift to the sestet, and you see the shift is signified here by a change in the rhyme scheme. CDE, CDE, you may have some variations on that, but you'll shift into this sestet, and now the poet is going to give some type of answer or solution or further address the issue that they brought up in the octave. So it's important that you can understand this shift, that you can understand the structure, because once you have this, you have a way into the sonnet that's going to help you not only be able to identify it, that's not the important thing, but be able to use these structural clues to help you make meaning and determine meaning of the poem.
We're going to look at different aspects of poetic structure, right? Because I think students, you need the vocabulary. You need to know what it is that you're looking for, I think. The first thing is the closed form poem. And that's sort of what Miss Barber was already talking about. The sonnet, right, is an example of a closed form poem. It's a poem that is defined by different structural features. And those features, again, can help you make meaning of the poem. And by the way, whenever you learn or you recognize a specific pattern, it's also important to see if that pattern deviates, because sometimes that is where the real interesting things are happening in the poem. A villanelle is another example of a closed form. There's many types, and you guys can look those up, but it's really not worth learning or memorizing for the exam or for any course, a long laundry list of closed form poems. What's important to recognize is there is structure in poetry, and some of these structures are more widely recognized, I guess, by readers of poetry. We also talked about line arrangement or stanza formation. If I give you a 30-line poem and all lines are in one block, in one stanza, right? A stanza is a poetic paragraph, if you will, right? That's how we would talk about it in prose. Well, those 30 lines could be daunting, right? And maybe that poem is a daunting poem. Maybe it's about a difficult experience, and it's just one long laundry list of um, maybe jarring images. But a lot of poems, maybe most poems, are organized into stanzas. Well, this is a visual cue. I would like to know, how many stanzas are there? Are the stanzas the same line length, right? Is it, do we go from triplets or 3-line stanzas to quatrains or 4-line stanzas? And then if you recognize that sort of shift in the structure, the next thought has to be, well, why did the poet change, right? Why did the poet make this very deliberate shift or change in the structure? We got to tie that back to meaning somehow. And there's 3 others here.
So another structural element that we should consider as readers of poems is punctuation. And we should always let punctuation guide our reading, but it's so easy to overlook sometimes. But the poet uses punctuation to group words together. And this can be a signal to us as reader. Why are these particular words grouped in a sentence? Or maybe why are they set apart with a comma? So maybe there's like a subtopic within a sentence, or possibly there's a colon to signal something is coming. So it's important for us to pay attention to punctuation when we're reading. I like to remind my students that they should read poetry like prose. And what I mean by that is, I think a lot of readers are tempted when they read poetry to stop at the end of every line. And that sometimes gets confusing when we are trying to make meaning of what each line is saying. If we will stop and read sentences together or clauses together, then we have those words that are grouped together, and it's easier to understand the idea as a whole.
Absolutely.
So
Follow the punctuation, right?
yes, let
Yeah,
the punctuation guide your reading.
absolutely.
And we're going to demonstrate that in a minute. Also, rhyme scheme. And y'all are really good at being able to identify rhyme scheme and being able to label it. But we need to move to the next step and think, why is this rhyme important? How does rhyme group words, group lines together? How does rhyme even tie words together? We can think about the 2 words that rhyme, or maybe
Absolutely.
all the words that rhyme, and think, let's focus on these words that are rhyming. Those are often ways into the meaning of the poem, to pull those rhyming words out. Rhyme is so interesting because it's one of the few elements of literature that forces us to go back into a text and relook at something that we've already read. It just takes us back into the text. So I love that. Let's think about rhyming words when we're reading. And finally, we'll talk about shifts. And shifts, like I said, in the sonnet, you will often see this at line 9. And shifts in the sonnet are signified a lot of times with words like but or thus or yet. But really, you can have multiple shifts in a poem, and it can be a variety of shifts. You may have a shift in a time period, like somebody is talking in the present and then they shift to the past, or maybe a setting shift. It's winter, and then the speaker shifts to summer. Maybe the speaker shifts, maybe the tone of the poem shifts. So shifts are important because that allows us as a reader to see the progression of ideas in the poem. So if you can identify shifts, you're well on your way to working your way through the meaning of a poem.
I think it's important also to keep in mind that while we've given these 5 bullet points under this slide, right, poetic structure, these are skills, these are ideas that will be found in other genres, right? In a novel, we're still going to look at punctuation. We're still going to look at shifts. Of course, we're not going to look at rhyme scheme and closed forms and prose, but it might be important. It might be a good idea for you guys out there watching these videos to maybe keep a composition book and take notes on each of these videos, because these aren't isolated topics. Although we're trying to isolate them for you because we're trying to organize them for you and for ourselves, but these things really transcend. The whole notion behind this is the more we talk about literature, the more we talk about all these structural aspects or figurative aspects, then the better we'll become as readers. So it's important to keep these notes and carry them over onto the videos that we'll be making through the weeks ahead.
So let's go ahead and jump in and look at some of the things that we've been talking about and apply it to a poem. We're going to look at a poem by Anna St. Vincent Millay today, and you see her time period here. Just a quick note here about the speaker of the poem. Now, anytime you have a College Board prompt, you're going to have the author's name and typically a time period. And that's important to know because we look at this time period, 1892 to 1950, we know that not many women are writing poetry or writing at all during this time period. And Millay was really a pioneer for women in poetry and a front runner to a lot of our modern poets today. So that date does give us some information, but when we're reading a poem, we can't assume that the speaker of the poem is the same as the poet. So they're two different. The speaker may possibly rely on some of Millay's experiences, but we cannot assume that they are one and the same person. So just that note as we move forward.
Yeah, that's very significant. Whatever's on that prompt sheet, I say use it, right? Filter it through your analytical mind, but make sure that you always do separate the poet and the speaker. That's critical, I think, as a reminder for students. So let's look at the poem. The poem is "What Lips My Lips Have Kissed and Where and Why." It's a provocative poem, I think, right? I mean, you were talking about Millay as this bold woman, right? Creating these roads for poets. Well, these titles are gonna capture a lot of attention here. So let's look at what she has to say. What lips my lips have kissed, and where and why I have forgotten, and what arms have lain under my head till morning. But the rain is full of ghosts tonight that tap and sigh upon the glass and listen for reply. And in my heart there stirs a quiet pain for unremembered lads that not again will turn to me at midnight with a cry.
Thus in winter stands the lonely tree, nor knows what birds have vanished one by one, yet knows its boughs more silent than before. I cannot say what loves have come and gone. I only know that summer sang in me a little while, that in me sings no more.
Well, now that we're all depressed, right? Let's, something I tell my students all the time is you have to approach poetry with the understanding that this is someone's favorite poem, right? If you read a poem and you're like, oh, I don't like this poem, you're not going to write a very interesting essay. So you have to position yourself. Someone loves this poem. What do they see in it, right? We're talking about structure, so we got to look at the poem, right? Use our eyes, and we see automatically we have 14 lines. All right, that may tell us something. What may it tell us? It might be a sonnet, right? But that's not enough for us to make that determination. If we look at the rhyme scheme, if we look at the rhyme scheme, we see that it does follow that Petrarchan convention that Miss Barber talked about. Now, for the formalists out there, we know that sonnets obviously deal with meter as well, right? We're looking at iambic pentameter. We're looking at going through a process of scansion and prosody, but we're not going to get into all that right now. I think it's sufficient to say that if you have 14 lines and you have this rhyme scheme, we could very safely, very comfortably say that we have a Petrarchan sonnet. Well, that's significant because if you remember Ms. Barber's advice, that tells you that you got to look right between the 8th and the 9th lines, because that's going to give you where the shift might be, right? The poetic volta, the turn of the poem. And at that point, I'm no longer going to look at the first 14 lines. What I'm really going to do is see the poem as two different structural uh, features, the octave and then the sestet. So when we look at the octave, we're looking at someone who's reminiscing. We're looking at someone who is thinking about former lovers, perhaps, but but the memory is a little foggy, right? Um, it it there's a lot of things that she has forgotten, right? Including maybe who these people were. And in this fog, what does come through is the image of the ghost, that ghost that it's almost like the ghost in a Christmas Carol, right? Coming back and visiting her and tapping and sighing upon the glass and listening for reply. But she cannot answer. And she knows that these people are not truly there. And what she's left with is this quiet pain for the unremembered lads that won't join her anymore. This is what the octave says. I maybe understand the octave and I don't understand the sestet. So maybe as I'm writing my essay, I'm going to focus more on that octave and let that drive my interpretation. But it's much easier to think of the poem as two different sets than all 14 lines together.
So now we're going to look at the sestet. And again, this is where we have this shift. We know in the sonnet that it's built in. And we have this shifting word, thus. So that just confirms to us what we already know, that there is going to be a shift. But the shift is really interesting here. So let's look at that. We shift now and we have this winter imagery immediately after the shift, and a lonely tree, and the birds are vanishing one by one. And the speaker continues through the poem, saying that summer has sang in me for a little while, but that song is no more. And so we have this shift to almost an acceptance or a resolution of this is where I am with love now. And I think it's really interesting because a lot of times we expect a shift to almost be night and day, happy to sad, joyful to mourning. But shifts can be more subtle to that. And like in this poem, a shift is more of a resolution and an acceptance within the speaker's soul than this change of circumstances.
Absolutely. And I think that's critical because I could see my students saying, I don't see the shift. It starts sad, it ends sad. Where is the difference, right? And the difference is in her headspace.
Mm-hmm.
she is sad, and she is sad perhaps throughout the whole poem, or nostalgic, or whatever synonym you may want to use, but there is an understanding at the end of what is going on, whereas in the beginning, we the poem opens with what, right? That's already a query. It's a question. It's I'm not sure what is going on. And if you look at line 13 and line 10 and line 11, look at how many times she repeats the word knows or no, right? So there's definitely a shift to greater understanding of her situation. And that's critical. And I think that's where the turn of the poem is.
Mhm, for sure. Okay, so now we are just going to check and review what we have talked about today. We looked at this poem. We have determined it's a sonnet, and we have figured out that it is divided into an octave and a sestet. And that's important because that helps us to chunk the poem and to be able to approach it section by section instead of just 14 lines at once. We also have learned that we have this shift in sonnets at line 9. So the shift is built in. We know exactly where to look there. Also, we have talked about the rhyme scheme. Well, let me go in order. The line arrangement, the stanza formation, I talked about that. Punctuation. It's so interesting that here the punctuation in a lot of ways mimics the structure, because if you will look at the poem, look and see where the first period of this poem is. And it's at the end of the octave. That is all one thought. Even though it is broken into smaller subtopics, that's all one big idea. So use the punctuation to group words together. Think about it as a whole sentence, and think about different clauses and then phrases within that sentence that are grouped together by punctuation. The rhyme scheme, again, it ties words together. And so you have words, let's see, like reply and cry that rhyme. That's interesting to think about those two words. Why and sigh rhyme. Pain again. So we have these rhyming words, and it's interesting just to think about how those point and direct us to the speaker's feelings and to just central ideas expressed in the poem. And finally, we see the shift as one from remembrance to one of acceptance and resolution within the soul.
One of the things that I do want to bring up, because I can imagine some students looking at one and gone and thinking, how do those rhyme, right? If I were in kindergarten, I might fail that rhyming test if I say those are rhyming words. And perhaps you're right. In the truest sense, one and gone don't sound the same, do they? And this is the part of rhyme scheme that can get complicated at times, right? Where you have to determine, well, does the poet intend for these lines to be joined by rhyme? We know that they're spelled almost the same, right? Gone obviously has that G in the front, but then the rest of the letters are the same. What's important, I think, the advice I can give you is, once a pattern has been established, try to continue that pattern. And unless the words are, like, say, red and black, where those two would definitely be different rhyming words, if they look similar, and usually with rhyme we're just talking about sound, but if they look similar, consider giving it the same letter, right, when we're doing the rhyme scheme, but then that could be fodder for your essay as well. Why is it? We would call it a slant rhyme or a near rhyme or an off rhyme. You may want to jot those down, or once these videos are out there in the internet for the world to see, you can pause it and write those down and look those up, because I do think, like I said, it's fodder for your essays. Why would Millet, who has rhymed perfectly throughout, give us that slant rhyme of won and gone towards the end of this poem? And can you connect that slant rhyme perhaps to the emotional state, or the psychological state of the speaker?
Yeah, I also think it's good habit to get into for looking for consistent rhyme patterns, because then when that pattern is broken intentionally, then we know that's a signal too. And we'll address that when we get to modern poetry, probably more. But yes, we want to train ourselves to look for these patterns in rhyme. That's a good way to read poetry.
Absolutely. So far we've been talking about poetic structure, and we looked at the closed form, we looked at the sonnet, we talked about possible shifts, we looked at how lines or stanzas might help us chunk the text, how we have to follow punctuation, and look at those punctuations as clusters of information that deserve our attention, and we understand that they're units, right? And we move through the poem through these units that are marked by the punctuation. But you may never see this poem by Millet ever again. And that's something I always say in my classroom. It's not about learning this poem,
Mhm.
because that's it. You're never going to see it. I'm never going to give it to you on a quiz or an exam. You're probably not going to see it on your AP test or some exam in college. The idea is, what are the skills that I have learned or mastered or finessed through this lesson that'll make me a better reader next time I encounter a poem, and ultimately a better writer when I'm tasked with the challenge of writing an essay. I've been saying something in my classroom since about 2003, 2004, which is, it becomes sort of a saying. I tell my students, you don't know a piece of literature once you have all the answers. You know
Mhm.
a piece of literature once you have asked all the right questions. And it's important. My students get very frustrated with me sometimes because they ask me questions and I tell them, good job, right? And they say, well, what's the answer? I'm like, well, I don't, it doesn't matter. I'm proud of the fact that you came up with the question because you're thinking in the right way. So through this lesson, we've been talking about poetic structure. What we want to empower you is with being able to ask the right questions about a text structure next time you encounter text, next time you encounter a poem. So we want to look at these questions, and these questions are tied to the, the objectives or the skills that are part of this course. So the first question is, how does a text organization and arrangement of ideas and details in lines, stanzas, sentences, paragraphs, chapters, or other sections of text contribute to a text structure? So again, we've looked at how lines form stanzas, poems themselves can be broken off into different sections or structural components, and that helps us chunk it and be able to interpret the meaning of the poem. The second one is, how does a poem's rhythm and or rhyme contribute to its structure? Today we focused on rhyme. And sometimes I'll tell students, if the poem is very, very long, you may not want to do rhyme scheme. Maybe it'll take you too long to do rhyme scheme. But if it seems to be, you know, 10 to 20 lines long, go ahead and invest that time. It should only take you about a minute because of the amount of information that you may extrapolate from recognizing the structural features that are inherent in the rhyme scheme. The next question is, what is the organizing principle in a section of text that makes it a cohesive unit? We've talked so much about chunking today, Ms. Barber. We've talked so much about finding the structural components and just dealing with those things in isolation, but that's not the goal. The goal is at the end, we put the whole poem together. We understand the parts, but we only understand the parts to make better sense of the whole. And that is key. We have to understand how, not just how it functions as a whole, but also how those parts function with each other.
So some other questions that you can ask when you're approaching poetry. What's the relationship of a section of a text to the text setting, character, plot, conflict, point of view, thematic idea, really any literary element? We want to think about, not, as Mr. Escobar said, not things in isolation, but how did they fit together as this piece of a puzzle that all makes the text? How do all of these ideas work together and reinforce the same idea? Also, what's the relationship of a section of a text to other sections of a text? Just again, we've discussed how the octave and the sestet, they both stand alone, but they both work together. And the relationship of a section of a text to the text as a whole. And even when we think about the whole meaning of a text, it's even broader than the text, but it speaks to us as humans and these universal ideas and feelings and things that we all grapple with throughout time and history and place. So these tools, these questions, they're just tools for you to have when you approach a text, and they offer you ways into the text. And like Mr. Escobar said earlier, I think it's important, you will not read a poem and probably ask every one of these questions, and you will not be able to answer all of these questions, but you choose the ones that help you get into a text, and then you enter that way and you move forward with what you know and what you understand, and then more will be unlocked to you.
And this idea of asking the right questions because they'll lead to greater interpretation or deeper analysis is so critical that it might be a good idea for all of you out there right now to take a screenshot of this, right? Either with your take a picture with your phone or take a screenshot on your laptops. And I don't think you should memorize these questions. That's not the right approach. I think what you need to do is make these questions your own. Read through them, see which ones make the most sense to you, see which ones are the ones that you really understand that you think you can execute. You can provide an answer for that question, and then jot those down in your own words so that they mean something to you, and that they can live, they can be a part of who you are as a reader next time you approach a text.
So we have some practice for tonight. If you feel like you just want to take a few minutes and try for yourself what we've been talking about today. And from now on, for the rest of the lessons, we will open each lesson reviewing the practice activity from the prior day. So for tonight's practice.
And Ms. Barber, if I could just chime in 1 second, I was thinking about because we have teachers watching us as well, right? And the teachers are doing distance learning with their own students. This might be a great vehicle, a great launching pad, if they choose to make this what they're doing with their students, in their own sessions with them, and maybe work with them collectively on this.
Right.
And we'll all tune in tomorrow and see what we have to say about these practices.
Yeah, and hopefully this can be an avenue for you to have further conversations with your teachers. And this will just be a platform to extend the conversation in your own virtual learning platforms that you're doing with your teachers. So we are just hoping to come alongside teachers and just reinforce what y'all are already doing.
Absolutely, yeah.
So for tonight's practice, we're going to look at the 2014 released question, and it's another sonnet. For that, he looked not upon her. I promise we won't talk about sonnets in all of our units, but today we are. So what we want you to do for tonight's homework, you're not going to write a full essay, but for tonight's practice, unless your teacher wants you to. For tonight's practice, we just want you to read this and make some notes on the structural element of this sonnet. And just think about the things that we've talked about today, the overall form. line arrangement, punctuation, rhyme scheme, and shifts. And then once you've thought about that and possibly made some marks on it, there, if you look in the description under this video, there is a link to this if you would like to print it out and write on it, annotate on it. Once you've looked for those things and identified those things, write down 2 or 3 ideas about how these can point us back, give us more understanding of an interpretation of the poem, because we don't just want to identify these things and think on them, but we want to tie them to meaning. And we want to see how the poet is using these structural elements to reinforce the central idea of a poem. So if you'll write down 2 or 3 claims, we'll open tomorrow's lesson talking about that.
Absolutely.
So, do you have anything else, Mr. Escobar?
Well, this was my first foray into the virtual world and the internet. So, I like I said in the beginning, I do want to feel like I'm talking to my students. I want to feel like you're all part of my classroom. My wife and I, we're both teachers, and we both think about our students. Let's say on Thanksgiving dinner, for example, right? And we, after today, I think we're gonna have a much longer dinner because we have a lot of students out there, hopefully. We want you to know that what Miss Barber and I are sharing with you is intended to supplement or to support what your teachers are already doing. Your teachers are masterful. Whatever we say is just meant to support what they're already doing. So as soon as this video ends, how about you all write an email to your teachers thanking them for what they're doing and telling them to join you in watching these videos so that we can grow this community and we can all learn from each other. Take care, everyone.
We've enjoyed hanging out today, and we'll see you again tomorrow. Thank you.
Bye.